First, we're going to get started with the fact that success as a species demands that sensory systems accentuate changes of stimuli. There are two suppression strategies available. Many sensory systems have accessory structures that can reduce the level of input in the sensory pathway. Neural connections descend from the brain to lower stations in the sensory pathway in a top-down process, meaning that the upper brain controls activity in the lower center of the body and brain. Each sensory system has its own distinctive pathway, which leads to clusters of neurons. The neurons then have axons that connect to other groups of neurons. This results in sensory modality, which is touch, vision, and hearing, that has distinct hierarchy of traits and stations in the brain known as sensory pathways. Info reaches the thalamus before being relayed to the cortex. The thalamus then is in charge of either empathizing or suppressing info it receives. The somatosensory receptive fields have either an excitatory center or an inhibitory surrounding. It detects edges and discontinuities with objects we feel. Different size, shape, and quality of stimulation is a part of the receptive fields. Each of the neurons from the receptor cell in periphery to the brain have receptor fields, and they react to particular stimuli. Different cortical regions produce info differently. They involve separate maps. The first main map is the primary somatosensory cortex, and it receives most of the info about modality from the thalamus or the secondary sensory neurons. All the other maps are known as the secondary sensory cortex. It receives direct projections from primary somatosensory cortex. Attention can be either a top-down process or be changed through a distraction. The postparietal lobe is involved with attention. If it expects a stimulus, there is more excess of a response. Lesions result in attention deficit problems. The cingulate cortex is also involved with attention. One sensory system influences perception derived from another sensory system. Sensory neurons in the brain, the association areas, are a mix of inputs from different modalities. This is known as polymodal, and it provides a mechanism for the intersensory interactions. Next, we're going to go on to the skin. There are three separate layers of skin. The most outermost part is the epidermis, and then below the epidermis is the dermis layer. The dermis layer contains nerve fibers inside connective tissue, which allows it to move by choice. Below that is the hypodermis, and that's the most innermost layer of the skin, and it acts as an anchor for muscles, and it contains the Pacinian corpuscles, and it's also responsible for the shape of our bodies. So then also, Pacinian corpuscles are a type of touch receptors, light touch receptors, known as tactile receptors. 200 hertz of stimuli is needed to stretch the nerve fire to reach threshold in the Pacinian corpuscles because of its onion-like protective shield. It perceives the form of an object. The Meissner's corpuscles are fast adapting, and the Merkel's discs are slow adapting. The Merkel's discs have inhibitory surround with increased spatial resolution. They are especially responsive to isolated points on a surface, whereas the Meissner's are more populated than the Merkel's discs. They have less spatial resolution. They respond to changes in stimuli. However, both the Merkel's discs and the Meissner's preferentially respond to edges on the surface. And this is because of a special ion channel, piezo2, which depolarizes cells. All of these tactile receptors have moderately large myelinated fibers, which means that information can travel very quickly. The dorsal column system is in which touch receptors send axons to the spinal cord, which then enter the dorsal horn and turn upward to travel along the dorsal column. After that, they'll enter the brainstem and synapse on neurons of the dorsal column nuclei. The skin surface is divided into bands corresponding to spinal nerves, known as the dermatome.